I thought I had found a peaceful place for my father. But behind the green lawns and neat houses lurks a nightmare. A tyrannical ruler who is willing to manipulate, threaten, and even risk his life to maintain control. And I am the one who ended it all. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next exciting content. I will never forget the moment I realized my father needed me more than ever. He had been a hero, a veteran who had fought for his country, a father who had worked his whole life to give me a future. But then time began to take his strength. At first it was just mild pain, a slowing of his steps. Then there were mornings when he couldn't get out of bed without help, times when his hands shook so much he couldn't even pour himself a glass of water. The doctor told me he needed a quiet environment, a place without stairs, without distractions that would add to his stress. And I knew I had to act. I searched all over Austin, Texas for the right home. I wasn't just looking for an apartment to live in, I was looking for a place where my father could recover, where he wouldn't feel like a burden, where I could care for him without worrying about the little things. Noisy, crowded neighborhoods were out. Places that were too far from the hospital, too isolated, weren't right either. I needed a place that struck the perfect balance, peaceful but not too far from amenities. Then I found it. A peaceful neighborhood with green lawns, clean streets, and small, well-maintained homes. As I drove slowly through the neighborhood, I saw neighbors smiling at each other, children playing in the sun, old people strolling on the brick sidewalks. It looked picture perfect, a place one could truly call home. No city noise, no chaos, just the peace I had been searching for all these weeks. The house I chose was at the end of a tree-lined street. A one-story house with a spacious front yard and a small porch where my father could sit in the morning enjoying the breeze without having to worry about anything. Inside, everything was perfect. No stairs, wide hallways, a bright and quiet living room. I could imagine my father sitting in a recliner, sipping coffee, looking out the window, without worrying about his failing health. I didn't hesitate. I bought the house right away, moved in the furniture, and rearranged everything to suit my father's needs. I installed handrails in the bathroom, neatly arranged the medicine cabinet, and placed a large recliner in the middle of the living room where he could sit and rest without feeling tired. But most importantly, I installed a small ramp at the entrance. A simple ramp that didn't take up much space and didn't bother anyone, just to help my father get in and out more easily, without having to exert himself. Everything was perfect, or so I thought. I believed I had found a safe place for my father, a good community where he could live out the rest of his life undisturbed. But I was wrong beyond belief. Because this place was not all green lawns, nice houses, and peace that I had expected. Underneath that perfect veneer was a tyrannical force, a woman who lived by controlling and manipulating others, a woman who cared about no one but herself, a woman who could make my father and I's lives hell with the wave of her hand. And her name was Linda Hawthorne. I thought I had found the perfect place, a quiet neighborhood, a suitable house, a place where my father could live comfortably without having to worry about anything. But as soon as I moved in, I quickly realized that the peace here was just a thin veneer. And the person who pulled down that veil was none other than Linda Hawthorne. I met Linda on the first day I moved in. There was no friendly greeting, no welcoming smile, no welcome to the neighborhood. Instead, the first thing I got was a scrutinizing stare from a woman whose blonde hair was tied so tightly that it seemed to pull at her scalp. In her hand, she held a clipboard, a weapon of power, a symbol of control that I hadn't recognized at the time. Linda didn't approach me with a friendly attitude, but rather with a coldness. The self-appointed ruler of the neighborhood. When she opened her mouth, her tone was like a dagger. There was no question about whether I needed help, no concern for why I was moving here, just a command: "You can't park the moving truck here. The HOA doesn't allow it." Before I could even put my stuff down, before my father could even enter the house I'd prepared, Linda appeared like a nightmare in broad daylight. I tried to stay calm, explaining that I just needed a little more time to unload the rest of my stuff, that I would move the truck soon. But she didn't care. To Linda, the rules were the rules, and the rules here were hers. "If you don't move it right now, I'm calling a tow truck." It wasn't a warning, it was a direct threat, but that was only the beginning. As her eyes swept across the driveway, I could see her face contort, as if she had seen something disgusting. She raised her finger, pointing to the small ramp I had installed in front of the door, a simple, inoffensive thing just to make it easier for my father to get around. But to Linda, it was a serious violation. "That has to go." I looked at her, confused. "What?" Linda pursed her lips, her tone filled with disdain. "That ramp, it's a nuisance. We don't allow changes without HOA approval." I felt anger rising inside me. The public view? A small ramp that allowed an elderly person to enter and exit his house without struggling up a flight of stairs. Was that bad for the neighborhood? But Linda didn't care. To her, things had to be controlled her way, regardless of the circumstances of others. "If you don't apply for approval, I'll have to issue a fine," she said, her tone almost as if she were granting a favor, as if I should be grateful that she hadn't immediately ordered me to take it down. I understood then. Linda Hawthorne was more than a difficult woman. She was a dictator, a control freak, someone who had a modicum of power and was willing to use it to make other people's lives hell. She was not just a rule-abiding citizen, she lived for the rules. She enjoyed the feeling of dominating, of being able to manipulate and force others to obey. I could see it in her eyes, the pleasure of forcing people to comply, of imposing unreasonable rules that no one dared to challenge. I could see the fear in the other residents, too, avoided glances, furtive glances through the curtains, as if they were used to this kind of thing but didn't dare speak up. I knew I had made a terrible mistake. I had thought I could bring my father here so he could live in peace, but I had not expected to enter a place ruled by a ruthless man, a place where peace could only exist if people obeyed Linda Hawthorne's orders. And I was not the type to submit. I had thought that my first encounter with Linda Hawthorne would be a minor incident, that if I ignored her, if I followed her ridiculous rules, she would leave me and my father alone. But I was wrong. Slowly but viciously, Linda began to attack us, not with direct confrontation, but with something worse. Meaningless rules, threatening reminders, tickets that came in the form of a recurring nightmare. 3 days after our first meeting, a letter from the HOA showed up on my doorstep. Notice of violation, unauthorized construction affecting neighborhood views. I opened it, and to my surprise, it was about the small ramp in front of my house, the one I had clearly explained was for my father. I scanned the letter looking for some provision that might justify this absurdity, but all I could find was vague language about neighborhood integrity and strict rules to maintain property values. There was no mention of the rights of people with mobility issues, no provision for exceptions for the disabled. Linda had deliberately circumvented the law, turning my father's ramp into a thorn in her side, something she could use to start her power struggle. I tried to stay calm. I sent in my application along with a letter explaining my father's health condition, even attaching medical documentation to prove he needed the ramp. But all I got was silence. No response, no meeting to review our situation. And then, exactly a week later, another letter arrived. Notice of penalty, unapproved work, violation fee, $250. I clenched the paper in my hand, feeling the blood boil in my chest. But Linda didn't stop there. Within a month, I received 3 more violations. One for grass growing too long, even though my lawn was as neatly trimmed as the neighbors. One for improper placement of trash can, even though I left it where the garbage man had asked. And the last one that almost made me laugh out loud at how absurd it was, failure to comply with storage standards for personal effects. The reason? My dad left his walker outside the front door one morning after a walk around the yard. Linda saw it, and the next day I got a violation notice. I knew these weren't the real issues. This was Linda testing me, pushing me to see how long I could last before I broke. She didn't want me to leave. No, she wanted me to submit, to bow my head in recognition of her power, to kneel before the tyranny she imposed on the neighborhood. The other residents were used to this. I could see it in their eyes every time I walked down the street. Some avoided my eyes, some just looked at me with pity, but no one dared to say a word. They were too used to Linda's game, too afraid to stand up to her, because they knew that if they stood up, they would be next. But I wasn't the type to bow my head. Every time I got a violation notice, I wrote it down. Every time Linda came knocking on my door with a clipboard in hand, I memorized every word she said. I'd been a cop long enough to know a power-hungry person when I saw one, and I knew that people like Linda, who craved power and control, often didn't stop at bullying their neighbors. If she could bend the rules to her advantage, if she could threaten and manipulate people to maintain her position, then she could go a lot further than that. And I decided to wait. I didn't respond. I let Linda continue to think she was in control, that she was pushing me to the limit, because I knew that if I did, it would be the final blow. I was used to Linda Hawthorne's harassment. The letters of violation, the unreasonable fines, the veiled threats, none of them surprised me anymore. I knew her game. She wanted me to feel pressured, to collapse under the weight of her self-imposed rules, to bow to her absolute power. But I didn't give in. I paid the fines when necessary. I followed the rules I knew were unreasonable just to spare my father more trouble. And most importantly, I documented everything. I didn't react the way Linda expected. And maybe that was what made her angry, because then she went further. Much further. That morning I was helping my father with some physical therapy exercises when there was a knock on the door. Not Linda's angry knock, not the frantic ringing of a bell from a boss. It was a serious, decisive knock, the kind I was all too familiar with in my line of work. When I opened the door, I saw 2 people standing before me, a man and a woman, both in business attire, holding familiar clipboards. I didn't need an introduction. I knew who they were at first sight: social services workers. The content of their conversation did not surprise me. An anonymous complaint had been filed with their center, alleging that my father was being neglected, living in unsafe conditions with inadequate resources for his health. They were here to investigate to see if I was really taking care of my father properly. I did not need to ask who was behind this. I did not need to find out who wrote the complaint. There was only one person in this neighborhood who wanted to do everything in their power to make my life more difficult. Only one person who wanted to control me so much that he was willing to destroy my reputation, willing to hurt my father just to satisfy his own selfish desires. Linda Hawthorne. I took a deep breath, fighting the anger that was boiling inside me. I let them in, let them see my father sitting in the recliner, a blanket draped over his legs, controlling the television with slightly shaking hands. I let them check the medicine cabinet, let them see each bottle of medication neatly arranged by time. Let them see for themselves the assistive devices I had installed in the house to help my father move around without difficulty. I answered all their questions calmly with undeniable facts. I had nothing to hide. I had nothing to fear. But my father was different. I could see his anxiety when he saw them. I could see his hands tighten around the blanket, his shoulders stiffen as they asked about his health. I knew what he was thinking. He was afraid that these people had the power to force him out of his home, to disrupt his life. He was afraid that everything I had worked to build, everything I had done to ensure his safety, could be destroyed by a single, unfounded petition. When they left, they said they found no signs of neglect or abuse, but they would follow up if there were any further reports. I knew they were just doing their job. I knew they weren't to blame, but that didn't ease my anger. Linda had gone too far. She wasn't just trying to make things difficult for me. She dragged my father into it, making him a pawn in her power play. She'd dared to make me look like I was irresponsible in front of everyone, even though she knew the truth was completely different. And I swore right then that she was going to pay. I thought Linda Hawthorne couldn't have gone any further. The constant harassment, the unreasonable fines, even the false reporting to social services, all of that was enough to make her a cruel person, but I still thought she was just a pathological control freak, a power addict who would bully others for the sake of her own ego. I didn't think she was capable of anything more terrible than that. I didn't think she would gamble with a human life. The day started like any other. My dad still had a persistent cough, but I was used to it. He took his medicine on time, sat in his chair, tried to hide his fatigue so as not to worry me. But as the morning wore on, I realized something was wrong. His breathing became more labored, his hands shook more than usual, and when he tried to stand up to take a few steps, his legs buckled. I rushed to his aid, feeling his body go cold. His breathing labored as if each inhalation was a battle. Fear filled me as I saw my dad's face pale, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. I didn't hesitate any longer. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, my voice firm but urgent as I described his symptoms. They said an ambulance was on the way. I ran to the front door, stood there, and looked down the street. The seconds that passed were like knives cutting into my patience. Then I heard a siren in the distance. I saw a red light flashing behind the row of houses. But just as I thought my father was about to be taken to the hospital, I realized something was wrong. The ambulance stopped abruptly a short distance from my house. It couldn't get into the street, and then I saw why. A barricade was blocking the road. A large "Do Not Drive" sign was placed right in the middle, and two cars were parked diagonally across each other, forming a perfect barrier. One of the cars belonged to Linda Hawthorne. I felt my blood boil as I saw her standing there, arms crossed, her face full of satisfaction. I ran toward her, my feet pounding the pavement, my heart pounding in my chest, not from fear, but from the anger that was burning inside me. Linda looked at me, showing no remorse, no sign of hesitation. Instead, she shrugged, her voice flat as if she were discussing the weather. "Sorry, but this is a temporary road closure. No vehicles allowed." I'd seen all sorts of people in my career as a cop. Liars, con men, even cold-blooded killers. But I'd never met anyone like Linda. Someone who could stand there, watch a man die, and treat it like a power play. I felt my whole body tense, my hands clenched into fists, but I knew I couldn't lose control now. Not now, not with my father lying there fighting for his breath. The ambulance sirens continued to sound, urgent, but the vehicles didn't move. One of the paramedics jumped out and ran toward me, yelling that they needed to get there right away. But Linda didn't care. She just stood there, stone-faced, arms folded, watching me, as if waiting to see what I would do next. I lunged at her, my voice sharper than ever. "You're obstructing emergency medical care. You're putting lives at risk." But Linda just shrugged. "Maybe you should have thought about that before you violated HOA rules." For a moment I felt all my patience snap. I'd put up with her for too long, but now she was no longer just a control freak. She was a real threat. Without another second, I rushed toward her car, ready to open the door and move it by any means possible. But before I could touch it, the paramedics decided to act. They abandoned the ambulance, grabbed their equipment, and ran toward my house. As they passed Linda, she still had a smirk on her face, as if she had won the game. But I didn't look at her anymore. I didn't care about her anymore. I had only one goal: get my father to the hospital. And when I saw my father being wheeled out on a stretcher, when I saw the paramedics checking his pulse, when they told me that if they had arrived just a few minutes later, the consequences would have been irreversible, I knew that Linda Hawthorne had just made the biggest mistake of her life. She didn't know that she had just pushed the wrong person into a corner, and I swore to myself that this would be the last time she would ever hurt anyone. I'm not the type of person to let something like that go. What Linda Hawthorne had done went far beyond simple abuse of power. She didn't just harass. She didn't just use rules to control the residents. She was willing to risk a human life to protect her own sick ego. And that meant I couldn't just sit by and take it. I had to take her down. But I knew that to do that, I needed something more concrete than anger. Linda was smart, not in a good way, but in the way that people who have spent their lives gaming the system do. She never did anything without a veneer of legality. Every violation notice, every fine, every action was covered up by the HOA. If I was going to oust her, I couldn't just rely on her blocking an ambulance or harassing me. I needed something bigger, an actual crime. And that's when I started investigating. I couldn't use my police title because I was working undercover and couldn't reveal my identity. But I didn't need a badge or official authority to expose a corrupt man. I'd worked with enough criminals to know that people like Linda, people obsessed with power, can't resist the temptation to profit. She didn't just like control, she liked money, and I had a hunch that her power extended beyond making meaningless rules. I started by looking into the HOA's finances. By law, HOA financial records must be made available to residents, but when I requested access, I only received a sketchy report with general expense reports without any details. That made me even more suspicious. No transparent organization would intentionally hide information like that. So I turned to residents. I started talking to neighbors who had lived here for years, who had received unfair fines like me. At first they were hesitant, they feared retaliation, but as I got a few people to talk, I began to see a familiar pattern. A pattern of fraud. Linda created a system where residents could be ticketed for minor violations, from mowing their lawns at the wrong time to placing their trash cans in the wrong place to having a small crack in their driveway. But it wasn't the fines that mattered. It was how they were collected. Some residents said that when they wanted to appeal, Linda would offer a softer solution. If they paid the fine directly in cash, the record of the violation would disappear. No receipts, no records, no trace of the money. That was the start. I dug deeper. I dug into the tax records, looking at the HOA's payments for maintenance services. I noticed that a cleaning and maintenance company was receiving a lot of payments from the HOA, and the numbers were unusually large. But when I checked the local business registry, I found a shocking fact. The company was owned by Linda Hawthorne. Linda not only abused her power, she used the HOA as a personal money machine. She created unreasonable fines to force residents to pay cash, then embezzled the money without accounting for it. At the same time, she hired her own company to perform maintenance work at inflated rates, essentially paying herself with HOA funds. This was more than abuse of power. It was embezzlement, fraud, and money laundering. But the evidence I had wasn't enough. I needed direct evidence of the money flow. I needed to see how she was transferring money from the HOA to her personal accounts. So, I started watching her more closely. I documented the times she took cash from residents. I took pictures of violation notices that the HOA never officially filed. I found some of her emails, including vague messages about additional fees that residents would have to pay if they didn't want to be troubled by the HOA. And then I found what I was looking for, a series of bank transactions showing Linda had been withdrawing money from the HOA and transferring it to her personal account. I had it all. Linda Hawthorne thought she was invincible. She thought her power would protect her forever, but she didn't know that by pushing me to the limit, she was digging her own grave. Now I had no doubt. I was no longer just a harassed resident. I was the one who would pull her down from the corrupt throne she had built for herself. I had everything I needed. The shady bank transactions, the fake fines, the dubious emails, even the cash Linda took from residents that never showed up on the books. But the most important thing, the irrefutable evidence, was the recording of Linda's voice, laughing about blocking my father's ambulance. One simple sentence was enough to burn down the corrupt empire she had built. If that old man can't follow our rules, too bad. His son should have thought about that before he violated the HOA. That wasn't just an admission, it was a conviction. But I couldn't act rashly. I needed a stage, a place where Linda couldn't hide, where she couldn't spin her story her way. I needed her to be exposed before the very people she had oppressed for years, and there was no better place than the monthly HOA meeting. I didn't attend these meetings very often. Neither did most residents, who wanted to sit and listen to Linda rant about neighborhood standards when she had already made all the decisions. But this was different. I spoke privately with some residents who had put up with Linda for too long but were too afraid to speak up. I didn't tell them everything I knew, but I promised them that this would be the last time we would have to put up with her. When the day of the meeting arrived, the hall was packed. Linda stood at the front, as always, with a fake smile on her face. She looked around the room, nodding at the few residents who, I assumed, were the ones who obeyed her every command without question. When she began to speak, her tone still authoritative, as if she were ruling a kingdom, I felt the anger simmering inside me. Then the moment I had been waiting for arrived. Linda clapped her hands, announcing that she would tighten the rules even further to ensure the neighborhood retains its highest value. Those words were my cue to act. I stood up and walked forward one step at a time. Linda rolled her eyes when she saw me, trying to keep her cool, but I could see the irritation behind her fake smile. "I have a question," I said, my voice slow but firm. "Linda, can you explain why tens of thousands of dollars from the HOA fund were transferred to a company owned by you?" The room fell deadly silent. Linda froze for a moment before smiling faintly. "What are you talking about? It's a baseless accusation." But I was ready for it. I set a file down on the table, letting the pages of evidence fall before everyone's eyes. Bank transactions, inflated payments, forged invoices. Linda flipped through the papers, and I could see her expression change from confident to panicked, but she wasn't giving up. She tossed the file aside, trying to smile faintly. "Who knows if these are fakes? You can't just throw papers out and expect people to believe these baseless accusations." I nodded. I had expected that. So I took out my phone, pulled up a recording and pressed play. Linda's voice filled the room. "If that old man can't follow our rules, too bad. His son should have thought about that before he violated the HOA. The air exploded. A few gasps, a few whispers, and then a chorus of boos. Someone cursed. A woman exclaimed, "I knew it! I knew she was a monster!" A man stood up, angrily talking about the money he was forced to pay to keep the HOA from harassing him. The murmurs turned into a wave of outrage. The room erupted into chaos. The once silent residents exploded with pent-up rage. Linda Hawthorne, who had controlled them with threats and manipulation, was now completely exposed. But instead of confronting her, she turned and ran. She charged toward the door, but the residents who had feared her now lined up, blocking the way. They didn't need to say anything. She had lost her power. Linda backed away, her eyes darting around for an escape route, but for the first time, she was trapped in her own kingdom. I stepped forward, flashing my badge. "Linda, you're under arrest." She froze, then backed away, stuttering as if she couldn't believe her ears. But before she could say anything, 2 officers entered, marching straight toward her. The warrant was ready. "Linda Hawthorne, you're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and obstruction of justice." She struggled, screaming, "You can't do this to me! I protected this neighborhood!" But no one listened. The snap of handcuffs around her wrists was the final bell toll on Linda's reign of tyranny. As she was led away, the residents watched in amazement. Then a clap, then another. Soon the room was filled with the sound of relief. They had suffered for so long, and now they were finally free. I stepped outside, taking a deep breath under the night sky. The phone rang. My father calling. His voice was weak but calm. "Are you done?" I looked out at the neighborhood, where for the first time since I moved here I felt truly at peace. "We're done, Dad."